Hi, and welcome to the Reclamation Project podcast. We are so glad that you're here, that you're listening, and that hopefully you're a part of the conversation. Today, we're starting a new series. We just got done with love and what it means to love people and ourselves and God. And now we're kind of piggybacking off of that and going into a new topic, which is marriage. And for some of you, as you hear that, you are turning the off button off. And I used to be the same way when I would go into church up until the point where I was 28 and we would talk about marriage. I was just like, okay, sweet. I don't have to come for the next few weeks. But I do want to say that even though we're talking about marriage, people who are single, people who are in relationships that aren't marriage, people that are in marriages, all of you can listen and all of you hopefully can glean something from this. We're going to be talking about marriage primarily, but you can also, when you hear that, insert your status there, because these things that we are talking about, I think, are transformational and can be used in any context that you're in. You can use them in your work relationships, in your friendships, in your in your couple relationships, and whatever you have going on, you can use it and you can extrapolate these principles into whatever relationships you go through day in and day out. But specifically, we're going to be using the term marriage. So substitute whatever you have into that, and I think you will be able to use this information as well. So with that said, we're going to tackle a new subject today, and that subject is going to be communication within marriage. And we all know that there's roadblocks there. So Gary, where are there roadblocks? What can we do with communication?
Well, like everything we've talked about before, we get a better understanding of what it is we're talking about when we define it. And even before we go there, as you were talking and doing the intro, I was thinking, you've been married almost 10 years, and I've been married 41. So between the both of us, we have 51 years of marriage.
And we know nothing.
And that does not make us experts. They say 10,000 hours makes you an expert. Well, I was just doing the math. We have over 500,000 hours of marriage, and we're still trying to figure stuff out. So I hope what we talk about might be useful. But like everything else, you have to learn certain things yourself. So as we get back to communication, let's define it, first of all, by saying what it's not. I mean, we're under the impression talking is communication. It's not. Talking is not communication. Nagging is not communication. Complaining is not communication. Comparisons is not communication. Really, communication conveys the idea that I'm sharing something and you understand it, and you share and I understand it. And if you've been married any more than 2 weeks, sometimes certain things happen. So some of the biggest roadblocks, there's a bunch of them. I think probably the foundational one is this. Two people come together, and what we find when you first get married is you have the same vocabulary and different dictionaries. And that is so good, I'm going to repeat it again, that we have the same vocabulary and different dictionaries. Let me give you an idea, Jeremy. You'll probably get a kick out of this. So I was pastor at a church for 17 years, close to 17 years. And when I resigned, was taking a different path. The first 2 Sundays, I didn't go to church. I'm thinking, this is cool. You get to do this on a Sunday? This is what NFL looks like, not on replay. This is amazing. That second Monday, my wife comes to me and she said, so what are we going to do? And I said, don't worry, hon, I've got a plan. You know, we're going to be moving on. And she said, yeah, but you don't know how to do anything. At that moment, I felt the flesh to kick in and the blood begin to boil. And then I had to stop and realize we have the same vocabulary, but a different dictionary. Her dictionary means this. In the way she grew up in a Midwest town with Midwest family, everybody not only did something important, but they also had a trade. All her family, even the tech geeks, if they got laid off, they could hang drywall, work on cars. And I've spent almost the entirety of my life in education and study and pastoring. So really what she meant was you don't have a trade to fall back on. Now, that would have been so much better for my ego to say that than you don't know how to do anything. Jeremy, have you ever said something to Katie and you were pretty sure of what you said, but you're like, she did not hear it that way? Can you think of anything?
Countless times, yes.
Without getting too personal or damning to yourself.
Well, is there a specific one? I don't know. It's just, it all blends together at this point.
Yeah.
I guess for me, it wouldn't be a definition necessarily, but maybe the way that we define things.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, my wife and I have a different definition of cleaning, right?
Yeah.
For me,
Yeah.
it's, she says, hey, can you clean up that room? It is, I'm picking up pillows off the floor, putting them on the couch. I am straightening the rug, and I am sitting down.
Yeah.
For her, it's taking a toothbrush with bleach on it to the tile and making sure every speck of dirt is been extinguished from our house.
So if she said, Jeremy, did you clean? And you said, yes, I did. You thought you communicated to her that you clean.
Yes, definitely.
According to her definition is you didn't even get close. So now we're back at strife again. So anytime you have different definitions while you share the same vocabulary, that starts to become a roadblock. You find that if you traveled international, in certain international American terms and the international terms are way different. And even hand gestures are different in some foreign countries. So, but I was thinking about that as we were talking before about roadblocks, and I think maybe even before that, especially in the Christian world, a roadblock comes kind of how we were taught. Maybe our definition of really what marriage is. Growing up in a Baptist church, and you as well. And we'll talk about this a little later in the podcast as we talk about expectations and roles. But what was a woman's place in the church when you were young, Jeremy?
It was not really existent. I mean, at least in the forefront, right?
Yeah.
So up front, you never had women preaching. You never had women leading anything. I mean, prayer, anything.
Yeah.
Didn't have them bringing down the collection trays. Didn't have. I mean, really, there was no forefront, but they're behind the scenes. They were doing a heck of a lot of work.
Yes.
So I mean, it wasn't real apparent that women were predominant in any way.
So I mean, if that's how we grew up, as it was modeled for you, then you would communicate different. There were certain things you think I don't even need to communicate to a woman at this point because she's this doesn't fit her role. And so it does go back to how we were raised. I was making some notes, and there's two views of what marriage is, and depending on what view you take will determine how you communicate with somebody. You're a manager at work, so you would communicate to a customer different than what you would to someone underneath you, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Tonality, definitions, just your attitude, and so if our attitude of what a woman's role is based on how God created, it will change the way we communicate. So the first one they call a complementarianism theory, which just basically says this: men were made to have authority over women, at least at marriage and in the church. And women were made to submit and be helpful to men, and together their different gifts and roles complement each other. Therefore, the term complementary theory. But some notes underneath this evidence to that theory would be men were made first before women. I mean, so that's one of the things they use as evidence. God gave the man his law directly before the woman's creation. Therefore, positionally, a man must be more important. Women were made to be a helper to men. The Bible clearly states that. I think Genesis 2, a woman is a helper to a man. You wouldn't communicate with a boss the same way you'd communicate with a helper. So if your viewpoint of someone is set in stone, it changes communication level. For Adam named all the animals, he even named Eve. Therefore, there's some kind of positional thing going there. And God says the husband will rule over his wife. And it says that clearly in Genesis 3. Because of sin, the husband will rule over wife. So with that viewpoint of a woman, it'll change the way you communicate. It's just the natural stance you take when looking at a different person. I kind of have drawn back and kind of adopted more of an egalitarian theory, which just says this: men and women were made in the image of God to rule together over creation and equal partnership. Genesis 1 makes no distinction to roles. To be like God includes ruling, caring, and creating like God. And this is the calling of men and women together. So some of the evidence of that is order of creation has nothing to do with authority. The fact that he was created first is not a sign of importance or authority. God gave his law as he should have once a human existed. So the fact that he gave the law to man first is not a point of importance. It just makes sense. Man's here. It's time for the rule book. As women being helpers, it's interesting. The Hebrew word for helper really refers to the strong helping the weak, the healthy helping the sick, the poor helping the rich. So if you want to stand that you're positionally higher because she's the helper, and biblically the helper has a predominant position. Again, going to change the way you communicate. The husband ruling over his wife is part of the curse after the fall, not part of God's design. So in the church, we were kind of taught positionally a woman and a man. But God said, I created them equal together. The fact that sin came in, and yes, Genesis 3 said that man would rule over, that was not God's initial design. That was what had to happen after sin. So just your viewpoint of men and women positionally is a roadblock to communication. Then at church, you saw it one way, and then you go home and see the way mom and dad communicate. What was it? Did your family have any kind of communication style? Like mine was loud. Mom said something, dad backed her up, and that was law. I mean, can you identify your communication style in your family?
Have you ever watched the show The Goldbergs?
No.
If not, do it.
And then I'll understand the Mustard family?
I'm binge watching it right now. It's so funny because when it came out, my sister said, "Oh my gosh, this is our family." You know, same time period.
Yeah.
The sister is the first born, then a brother, then another brother who's quite younger. It's amazing how just dead on to our family it is. But in there, they yell. Yeah. You know, our family was whoever can talk the loudest gets their point across. So that's how you communicate it, is you communicate through that. I mean, it's just how our family's Italian.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
Italians are loud and passionate.
Yep.
And so
and passionate means volume.
Yes, we exemplified that.
Yeah.
And that's how we communicate.
Yeah.
That's how we communicate to each other.
So part of our communication style is what we grew up with, what was modeled before us. And again, so you get two people coming into a marriage with different styles. So you got different definitions and different styles, and we wonder why we don't communicate. So I'll tell you, there's a great book out, and I have to give props to my mentor. He's a mentor to a few, but Dallas Dedman has a great book, Can You Hear Me Now? Really about the art of communication. Real communication is listening. The Bible's pretty clear on what it means to listen. It says those who talk before they listen is a fool, and I've replicated that in my marriage. I'm a great talker and not necessarily a good listener, and I already said up front that talking is not communication. So communication really is this: I speak not to win you over, to have you come to my position, to win, just to say, I want you to understand my position. And in order to do that, I need to know that you've heard me. And in order for me to understand, I don't have to agree with my wife or come to her side. I don't have to change my point of view. I just have to understand where she's coming from. I think that is probably the key to communication. And we all don't really do that well based on those obstacles I already laid out.
And knowing where someone's coming from really it stems from another key point of communication, at least in my mind, which is that I think you have to have clear expectations for each other in a relationship, in a marriage, in any relationship that you're in. If you know the person's expectations and what they're desiring at the end point, then it's easier to understand why and how they're communicating. You also brought something up where you said that, you know, how you grow up greatly influences how you communicate. Absolutely. Well, it also greatly influences your expectations. I think one of the biggest things that Katie and I had to get over is for 28 years, I did things the way that I had grown up, in the way that I had as I grew up. I had this type of lifestyle of how I do things, and then I was introducing this whole other person's way of doing things and their expectations in that. So, when I clean, for instance, we talked, but when I would do
this
dishes,
must be a real sore point for you. This is the second time you've mentioned it.
It was one of the hardest things is, when I would do dishes, for instance, my method of doing dishes is you rinse them, you throw them in the dishwasher, you turn on the dishwasher, you empty it later.
Yeah.
Right? Or in my bachelor days, you let them pile up for about 2 months and then you decide to do that. For Katie, it was, okay, you know what? We're going to wash the dishes first and then put them in the dishwasher to wash the dishes again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when she asked me to do the dishes, that's what I did. And,
Yes.
and it was a big sore point because her expectation is that this is how dishes are done, when my method for 28 years was this. And that's where we butted heads, was our communication. While we're using the same words, we had a different dictionary. While we're using the same words, there's a different expectation behind those words.
Absolutely. And if we don't communicate properly, which means to share our expectations correctly, how do we know? I was doing a marriage class at a church, and in that class there were like 3 ex-pastors. Wish I would have known that before I took the class. But I basically made a statement that communication is the most important thing in a marriage, and communication, the lack of it, is the biggest problem. One of the pastors raised his hand. He goes, well, I disagree with that. The biggest problem is fighting over money, fighting over family, and fighting over sex. And I disagreed with him. I said, no, it's communication about family, communication about money, and communication about sex. Therefore, I win, which when you're in front, you always win. But the truth is, it's that. So if I don't communicate my expectation to my wife, she has little to no chance of meeting that. One of the couples I counseled, I have them go through. In fact, I'll give you listeners this takeaway to do. I think it's really important when we combine expectations and communication. But I asked them to write down their expectations when they got married for each other. And one of hers was, her expectation is that they would never fight. That's not an expectation. I mean, he'll fail that every time. So I think communication is so important that everything we're going to talk about in this marriage relationship series really finds its origin in communication. If we communicate properly, you'll do conflict resolution better. You'll do blended family better. You'll do how do you breach infidelity or a lack of trust? Communication is really big. So, in fact, I'll give it to you now. So I'll give it to you, and if you could stop this podcast right now and go get a piece of paper, I'll wait for you. Okay, here we go. Do this little exercise at home if you're married. Write down 5 expectations you have for yourself in this marriage. Then write down 5 expectations you have for your spouse in this marriage. And then write down 5 expectations you have for both of you moving forward in this marriage. When you finish, sit with your spouse and communicate those. It's just your point of view. It's not necessarily about who's right or who's wrong. It's your point of view. When you got married, Jeremy, you probably had some unspoken expectations for Katie, and she had some from you. When you said "I do," what expectations came along with that for you? Again, based on how you grew up, where you grew up, what was modeled for you. You had expectations.
I think it goes back to what we talked about, a couple weeks ago, where we talked about, my insane love of chick flicks. If that's not a derogatory term by now, I don't know if it is. Yeah. So sorry, not trying to offend anyone. But, I saw this lifestyle modeled in movies and in TV, and that's what I thought marriage would be. I thought marriage would be, you come home and everything's great and grand and
honey,
everything
I'm home.
smells like roses
yeah.
and half the time when we first got married, she wasn't even home because she was working, and there's just certain expectations that things would be a lot more perfect than they are, I guess. Yeah. That love is this big passionate thing and it's intense and it's never ending And sometimes you get up in the morning, you don't even like the person that
Yeah.
you're getting up next to,
Yeah.
and you don't want to come home sometimes. But and again, this is when I first got married.
Yeah.
Not
yeah.
now.
Not now, dear.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But it was that the happily ever after syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I expected, and it's work. It's a lot more than it just fits together like a glove. It's
Never happens. In fact, if I was doing your premarital, actually, I think I did do
You
you guys'
did our
premarital.
premarital
Yeah, I don't think we covered expectations at that point. But what I would have, sorry, I'll take some responsibility for that, Katie. I didn't teach them how to clean properly. But what I would do now is, if you would have written that down as an expectation, I would have said, so your expectation would be like the movies. That's not a realistic expectation. So I would have crossed that off your list. So again, you don't know what's expected of you unless someone shares, and you don't know if it's relevant or realistic until you communicate that. A lot of times, as you do your lists at home and share your expectation for your spouse, you'll come to the point that that sounded good in my head, but it's not really realistic. So I've been married 41 years. My wife was 16 when we got married, and please don't call CPS, or was her parents allowed us to get married. And no, she wasn't. For some of you legalists who are thinking that, I know what you're thinking, and no, she wasn't. It was a little different back in the Stone Age. People got married younger. But my wife had an expectation that, well, the man goes to work and the woman stays home. And that really does work when the man has an excellent job. But when the man doesn't have an excellent job and he's going to school, that's not a realistic expectation from my point of view. So how much better would a marriage be if we discussed expectations before we said I do than after I said I do? What do you think?
I think a lot less people would be married if we had those
Yeah.
expectations laid out.
Yeah.
But it'd be different. I mean, you would go in, with a better understanding. You
Yep.
would go in with a better thought of what marriage is going to be. I recently sat with someone, had a meal with a friend, and talking about marriage, and I said, man, totally different from what I thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
It just is. Again, going away from the whole chick flick thing, but marriage is a lot of work, and it's a lot of communication. It's a lot of
Yep.
working through the times where we do communication poorly, and working
Yep.
through what those expectations are. And so if you had those expectations ahead of time, it would cut down on a lot of disagreements probably.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
it would cut down on a lot of
Potentially it would, yeah.
a lot of
Yep.
heartbreak and issues that young married people have.
I mean, if I know what's expected of me, I have a better chance of realizing that for them, or what's hooked really closely with expectation too in marriage are roles. So when I was married, when young, roles were men were the bread makers, not the bread makers.
Bread makers? You're a baker?
Wow, I just gave you a glimpse to my feminine side. No, I meant the breadwinners. And then the women stay home. Men took care of the hard stuff. Women did all the easy childbearing, as if that was easy. The men did all the outside work. The women did all the inside work. So again, that's a combination of expectations and roles. So you were married. Well, obviously, if I've been married 41, you're 10. You were married 31 years after me. What were the roles as you went into marriage? How did you and Katie define roles?
I think we really didn't discuss roles so much as we just kind of went with the flow. She was a student at the time.
Again, a knock on my premarital counseling.
She was a student at the time. I was working a full-time job. So we just kind of stayed in those roles. She worked part-time, was a student full-time. And I guess we approached it, if I had to say, we approached it more like a partnership. More like we both had say. Sometimes, the old school crept in, and we want, I felt like I had to lead and had to be the person making the decisions. But for the most part, it was, it was more of a collaborative effort.
Yep. That is where it took my wife and I years to get to that point because it really wasn't the cultural norm at that time, and I'm glad it has become that. That would actually fit into the egalitarian theory of what marriage is. It is a partnership. Let me ask you a question. Do you think God has expectations for us in a marriage?
I think more than roles, there's expectations, I guess. First one that comes to mind is two people become one.
Yeah.
That they're kind of intertwined together.
Loving unconditionally.
Loving
like
unconditionally,
Christ, yeah.
that their eyes are only for each other.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I mean, that you keep that marriage, holy, and
No, I agree.
that you both seek after Him. And
But so many times in the church we make the rules become more important than the roles. The expectations are the principles. How that works in my family, for example. My wife is amazing when it comes to anything mechanical. I may struggle hooking the right wires together before I turn on a ceiling fan. She hangs a ceiling fan. She does the plumbing. She could build a house. I cook. And study. That's what I do. And so, like, customarily, those don't fit the roles of a man and a woman. But principally, I can put her before me. I can love her unconditionally. I can keep my marriage pure. And that's where I think the expectations are. And how it plays out in roles is if Ephesians 5, he kind of sets it out for us. I think I'd mentioned before, I'm writing something about marriage called the Farmer and the Cheerleader, a love story. And really, he says in Ephesians 5 that the husband is to love his wife in the same way the husband ought to love his wife as their own bodies. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed it and care for their body just as Christ did for the church. So the farmer is the husband. In fact, the term husbandman is a farmer agricultural term. So as my expectations of God for me in my marriage as the husband or the farmer, I'm to make sure my wife is protected. I feed her. I nourish her. I protect her. One of my goals in premarital counseling is to say, let's use you and Katie for an example.
Okay.
Jeremy, you should be a better man because Katie's in your life, and Katie should be a better woman because you're in her life. Mm-hmm. So as the husbandman, I protect and I keep warm. I mean, that's that side of that mental image of a cold night and the farmer's out putting sheets over his crop just to protect. That's God's expectation for me. He doesn't spell it out into distinct roles where I could, pass or fail. And then a wife would be the cheerleader, which is at the beginning of the chapter 5, verse around 20, where it says that she's to submit. That word simply means to respect. A guy will do anything for the respect of his wife. She's the cheerleader. And what does a cheerleader do? They cheer no matter what. The team's down 40 and they're still saying, hold that line. They haven't held the line the whole dang game, but they cheerlead, And I tell women, I don't care how low you have to go, find something to cheer your husband, cheer about your husband for. Those are God's expectations. They're principles as opposed to hard and fast cut rules that the church likes to make.
So I think we've given some good descriptions of what communication looks like, what it doesn't look like, how it works well, how it doesn't work well. What are some of the things that we can tangibly do to communicate better with our spouse, our partner, in any relationship that we have?
Right. And you so aptly put it at the beginning, good communication is transferable across any relationship, friendship, marriage, work environment. But we're specifically honing in on like a marriage and a partnership, as you referred to it. So, and you challenged me after our second podcast about making sure we had some takeaways. I think it's really important. So let me give you a few things while you still have that piece of paper. Turn it over, and I'm going to make a small list that maybe you can incorporate into new expectations for your relationship and marriage when it comes to communication. The first one is to turn your you statements into I statements. Let me give you an example. Like you could say, or how it really happens is, you take me for granted. A lot of times a wife will say that to husband, you take me for granted. But if you turn it into an I statement, it doesn't sound so assaulting, or it doesn't sound cause me to defend my position. You could say something like, I feel at times as though I'm being taken for granted. Now, it sounds a lot the same, but from the listener's point of view, it doesn't sound like a full-on assault. Let me give you another example. So, you don't find me attractive anymore. That's usually the wife, although there's probably a man or two out there that has said that in this metrosexual age that we live in. You don't find me attractive, instead of saying, when we get intense about a subject, I allow myself to feel unwanted and unvalued. That says the same thing without being attacking. So one of your new expectations for communication is take the you statements out and make them I statements. That's you taking responsibility for your part of it. But what about when communication comes to you just disagree? You can actually, disagreements are amazing when you work through them, because there's a sense of accomplishment, and then making up is always pretty good too. So it's not a good reason to fight, but it's a good benefit of working through something. So let me give you a list of 8 while you're writing down. It's a takeaway of how to communicate when things are tough, and maybe you're in the middle of a disagreement. So one would be make sure you take it in private and keep it private. There are some disagreements that your friends at work don't need to know, your best girlfriend. You don't want to taint other people, family members. Like when you share with your spouse, you have an argument with your spouse and you share that with your family, it's really awkward the next time everybody gets together. So, keep it private.
Or when you have a podcast.
Or when you have a
you
podcast.
Don't put it on the podcast.
You don't talk about how your wife's definition of cleaning on
Got
the
it.
podcast.
Got
it. Okay. Make sure, number 2, make sure you keep it relevant. It's so easy when you start something to have that stream of consciousness. Now, you start to argue about cleaning, and the next thing you know, you're arguing about your debit card that you lost 17 years ago. Keep it relevant to the topic. Number 3, make sure you avoid character assassinations. You might have made a mistake, but that's what you did. That's not who you are. When we attack someone, we almost ruin the possibility of having real communication. That would go back to nagging, criticizing. That's not communication. Number 4, make sure that you stay in the moment. That's hard for most people to do. If you have children and you're having a disagreement and one walk in, it's hard to stay in the moment. You have to take care of any distractions, but staying in the moment is your best way of taking that communication to a result that'll be beneficial to both of you. Learn to accept feedback before you respond. This is where I'm not good. I haven't been good in the past. Critique, helpful criticism, I always took as just an onset assault to my person and my character and who I am. When I realized that sometimes feedback is important. When I was a pastor, when I was a teaching pastor, I'd teach on Sunday. I'd go in on Tuesday because Monday was our day off. I'd turn on my computer, and there it was. Every week, the same guy. He was my Lex Luthor to my Superman. He would have an email based on with a 10-point bullet point on what he did not like or didn't agree with my sermon. I got to where I would see his name and delete. Until one day I looked at it and I read his bullet points, and I had to admit some of his feedback was correct. Point 2 and 5, accurate and valid. The rest of them, crap. But again, feedback is important. And if my wife is trying to get a point across and she's actually doing it in the proper way, minus some of those things we talk, I look at her feedback and say, this may be helpful for me. There is a time limit to disagreeing in your communication. Sometimes you just need a break. And make sure you don't take a break without making a point to when will we resume this and bring this to a full, culmination. But set a time limit too, because the last thing you want to do, because I'm telling you, if your communication of a disagreement takes a long time, you end up not talking about the issue you started with. And last, you don't have to be intense to make progress. Be careful. Like for me, and you said it too, Jerry, I'm not Italian, but maybe somewhere in my lineage I am, because when I get passionate or excited, I get loud. Now my wife hasn't been, or I get angry. Those 3 things: angry and passionate or excited, I get loud. she is not, even at 41 years, sure of which one I'm in. So loud to her, her definition, back to her definitions, loud means I'm mad when I might be excited and happy. So I don't have to be intense to work on the progress of the communication. So I hope you write those down. I hope you practice them. And if you do, whether they work, let us know. If they don't work, you can email Jeremy at Reclamation Project. No, let us know. Let us know if this is helpful. And if there's something we didn't mention that you found successful in communicating in your marriage, please let us know. We'd love to add that to our list or have a talk over Facebook or Twitter about that. Please let us know. And Jeremy's going to bring it to close and give you all the ways you can come into contact with us.
Yeah, so first of all, I will say that if you found this helpful, if you find any of our podcasts helpful, feel free to share them. You can share through Facebook by just sharing one of our posts, and or through Instagram or Twitter or whatnot. But feel free to share them. We again just want to help people and just want to, hopefully our stories and our ramblings help you, and hopefully they can help others. So feel free to share this podcast with whoever you feel might need it. But there are a couple places you can contact us if you need help doing that or just want to give us feedback or whatever. And so the first one's Facebook, facebook.com/RP podcast. Also Instagram at RP podcast, and then on Twitter at the RP podcast. And, of course, on our website at www.rppodcast.com. Feel free to get in touch with us, give us feedback, let us know how this may have helped you, or if you feel like we're missing something, feel free to give us that feedback as well. We are so glad that you listened today, and hopefully this was helpful and impactful, and hopefully you can put it into practice. We will see you next time, and hopefully you have a great week until then. Thanks.